Okay, chapter 19. I plotted all of these out, so I'm gonna have these 4 chapters done. I got it. It's in my head. I got it. Okay, chapter 19. So I'm gonna read the first half and then the second half. The next video. So I think it's 399 to 408, 409. I'm not sure. Anyways. Okay, chapter 19, drifting towards disunion. The slavery question continued to churn the culture into controversy throughout the 1850s. As moral temperatures rose, prospects for a peaceful political solution to the slavery issue simply evaporated. Kansas Territory erupted in violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in 1855. 2 years later, the Supreme Court's incendiary Dred Scott decision extended formal protection to slavery in all the territories of the West. Attitudes on both sides progressively hardened. When in 1860 the newly formed Republican Party nominated for President Abraham Lincoln, an outspoken opponent of the further expansion of slavery, the stage was set for all-out civil war. Stowe and Helper, literary incendiaries. Sectional tensions were further strained in 1852 and later by an inky phenomenon. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a wisp of a woman and the mother of a half-dozen children, published her heart-rending novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Dismayed by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, she was determined to awaken the North to the wickedness of slavery by laying bare its terrible inhumanity, especially the cruel splitting of families. Her wildly popular book relied on powerful imagery and touching pathos. God wrote it, she explained in later years, a reminder that the deeper sources of her anti-slavery sentiments lay in the evangelical religious crusades of the Second Great Awakening. The success of the novel at home and abroad was sensational. Several 100,000 copies were published in the first year, and the total soon ran into the millions as the tale was translated into more than a score of languages. It was also put on the stage in Tom shows for lengthy runs. No other novel in American history, perhaps in all history, can be compared with it as a political force. To millions of people, it made slavery appear almost as evil as it really was. When Mrs. Stowe was introduced to President Lincoln in 1862, when Mrs. Stowe was introduced to President Lincoln in 1862, he reportedly remarked with twinkling eyes, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." The truth is that Uncle Tom's Cabin did help start the Civil War and win it. The South condemned the vile wretch in petticoats when it learned that hundreds of thousands of fellow Americans were reading and behaving her unfair indictment. Mrs. Stowe had never witnessed slavery firsthand in the Deep South, but she had seen it briefly during a visit to Kentucky, and she had lived for many years in Ohio, a center of underground railroad activity. Uncle Tom, enduring, left a profound impression on the North. Uncounted thousands of readers swore that henceforth they would not have nothing to do with the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law. The tale was devoured by millions of impressionable youths in the 1850s, some of whom later became the Boys in Blue, who volunteered to fight the Civil War through its grim finale. Excuse me. The memory of a beaten and dying Uncle Tom helped sustain them in their determination to wipe out the plague of slavery. The novel was immensely popular abroad, especially in Britain and France. Countless readers wept over the kindly Tom and the angelic Ava, while deploring the brutal Simon Legree. When the guns in America finally began to boom, the common people of England sensed that the triumph of the North would spell the end of the slave system. The governments in London and Paris seriously considered intervening on behalf of the South, but they were sobered by the realization that many of their own people, aroused by Tomania, might not support them. Another trouble-brewing book appeared in 1857, 5 years after the debut of Uncle Tom, titled The Impending Crisis of the South. It was written by Hinton R. Helper, a non-aristocratic white from North Carolina. Hating both slavery and blacks, he attempted to prove by an array of statistics that indirectly the non-slave-holding whites were the ones who suffered the most from the millstone of slavery. Unable to secure a publisher in the South, he finally managed to find one in the North. Helper's influence was negligible among the poor whites to whom he addressed his message, yet the South's planter elite certainly took note of Helper's audacity, which fueled their fears that the non-slave-holding majority might abandon them. The impending crisis of the South, with its dirty illusions, was banned in the South and fed to the flames at book-burning parties. In the North, untold thousands of copies, many condensed form, were distributed as campaign literature by the Republicans. Southerners were further embittered when they learned that their Northern brethren were spreading these wicked lies. Thus did Southerners, reacting much as they did to Uncle Tom's Cabin, become increasingly unwilling to sleep under the same federal roof with their hostile Yankee bedfellows. The North-South contest for Kansas. The rolling plains of Kansas had meanwhile been providing an example of the worst possible workings of popular sovereignty, although admittedly under abnormal conditions. Newcomers who ventured into Kansas were a motley lot. Most of the Northerners were just ordinary westward moving pioneers in search of richer lands beyond the sunset, but a small part of the inflow was financed by groups of Northern abolitionists or free soilers. The most famous of these anti-slavery organizations was the New England Emigrant Aid Company, which sent about 2,000 people to the troubled area to forestall the South and also to make a profit. Shouting, "Ho for Kansas!" Kansas. Many of them carried the deadly new breech-loading Sharps rifles, nicknamed Beecher's Bibles, after the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, who had helped raise money for their purchase. Many of the Kansas-bound pioneers sang John Greenleaf Whittler's marching song. We crossed the prairie as of old, the pilgrims crossed the sea, to make the West as they the East, the homestead of the free. The Southern spokesmen, now more than ordinarily touchy, raised furious cries of betrayal. They had supported the Kansas-Nebraska scheme of Senator Douglas with the unspoken understanding that Kansas would become slave and Nebraska free. The northern Nebraskans, allegedly by foul means, were now apparently out to abolitionize both Kansas and Nebraska. A few southern hotheads, quick to respond in kind, attempted to assist small groups of well-armed slave owners to Kansas. Some carried banners proclaiming, "Let Yankees tremble, abolitionists fall. Our motto is, give Southern rights to all." But planting blacks on Kansas soil was a losing game. Slaves were valuable and volatile property, and foolish indeed were owners who would take them where bullets were flying and where the soil might be voted free under popular sovereignty. The census of 1860 found only 2 slaves among 107,000 souls in all of Kansas territory, and only 15 in Nebraska. There was much truth in the charge that the whole quarrel over slavery in the territories revolved around an imaginary Negro in an impossible place. Crisis conditions in Kansas rapidly worsened. When the day came in 1855 to elect members of the first territorial legislature, pro-slavery border ruffians poured in from Missouri to vote early and often. The slavery supporters triumphed and then set up their own puppet government at Shawnee Mission. The Free Soilers, unable to stomach this fraudulent conspiracy, established an extra-legal regime of their own in Topeka. The confused Kansans thus had their choice between 2 governments, one based on fraud, the other on illegality. Tension mounted as settlers also feuded over conflicting land claims. The breaking point came in 1856 when a gang of pro-slavery raiders, alleging provocation, shot up and burned part of the Free Soil town of Lawrence. This outrage was but the prelude to a bloodier tragedy. Kansas in convulsion. The fanatical figure of John Brown now stalked upon the Kansas battlefield. Spare, gray-bearded, and iron-willed, he was obsessively dedicated to the abolitionist cause. The power of his glittering gray eyes was such, so he claimed, that his stare could force a dog or cat to slink out of a room. Becoming involved in dubious dealings, including horse stealing, he moved to Kansas from Ohio with a part of his large family, brooding over the recent attack on Lawrence. Old Brown of Osawatomie led a band of his followers to Pottawatomie Creek in May 1856. There, they literally hacked to pieces 5 surprised men, presumed to be pro-slavery rights. This terrorist butchery besmirched the Free Soil's cause and brought vicious retaliation from the pro-slavery forces. Civil war in Kansas thus erupted in 1856 and continued intermittently until it merged with large-scale civil war of 1861 to 1865. Altogether, the Kansas conflict destroyed millions of dollars worth of property, paralyzed agricultural agriculture in certain areas and cost scores of lives. Yet by 1857, Kansas had enough people, chiefly Free Soilers, to apply for statehood on a popular sovereignty basis. The pro-slavery forces, then in the saddle, devised a tricky document known as the Lecompton Constitution. The people were not allowed to vote for or against the Constitution as a whole, but for the Constitution either with slavery or with no slavery. If they voted against slavery, one of the remaining provisions of the Constitution would protect the owners of slaves already in Kansas. So whatever the outcome, there would still be black bondage in Kansas. Many Free Soilers, infuriated by this ploy, boycotted the polls. Left to themselves, the pro-slavery rights approved the Constitution with slavery late in 1857. The scene next shifted to Washington. President Pierce had been succeeded by the no less pliable James Buchanan, who was also strongly under Southern influence. Blind to sharp divisions within his own Democratic Party, Buchanan threw the weight of his administration behind the notorious Lecompton Constitution, but Senator Douglas, who had championed true popular sovereignty, would have none of this semi-popular fraudulency. Deliberately tossing away his strong support in the South for the presidency, he fought courageously for fair play and democratic principles. The outcome was a compromise that, in effect, submitted the entire Lecompton Constitution to a popular vote. The Free Soil voters thereupon thronged to the polls and snowed it under. Kansas remained a territory until 1861, when the Southern secessionists left Congress. President Buchanan, by antagonizing the numerous Douglas Democrats in the North, hopelessly divided the once powerful Democratic Party. Until then, it had been the only remaining national party, for the Whigs were dead and the Republicans were sectional. With the disruption of the Democrats came the snapping of one of the last important strands in the rope that was barely binding the Union together. Excuse me. Bully Brooks and his bludgeon. Bleeding Kansas also spattered blood on the floor of the Senate in 1856. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a tall and imposing figure, was a leading abolitionist, one of the few prominent in political life. Highly educated but cold, humorless, intolerant, and egotistical, he had made himself one of the most disliked men in the Senate. Brooding over the turbulent miscarriage of popular sovereignty, he delivered a blistering speech titled The Crime Against Kansas. Sparing few epithets, he condemned the pro-slavery men as hirelings picked from the drunken spew and vomit of an uneasy civilization. He also referred insultingly to South Carolina and to its white-haired Senator Andrew Butler, one of the best-liked members of the Senate. Hot-tempered Congressman Preston S. Brooks of South Carolina now took vengeance into his own hands. Ordinarily gracious and gallant, he resented the insults to his state and to its senator, a distant cousin. His code of honor called for a duel, but in the South one fought only with one's social equals, and had not the coarse language of the Yankee, who probably would reject a challenge, dropped him to a lower order. To Brooks, the only alternative was to chastise the senator as one would beat an unruly dog. On May 22, 1856, he approached Sumner, then sitting at his Senate desk, and pounded the orator with an 11-ounce cane until it broke. The victim fell bleeding and unconscious to the floor, while several nearby senators refrained from interfering. Sumner had been provocatively insulting, but this counter outrage put Brooks in the wrong. The House of Representatives could not muster enough votes to expel the South Carolinian, but he resigned and was triumphantly re-elected. Southern admirers deluged Brooks with canes, some of them gold-headed, to replace the one that had been broken. The injuries to Sumner's head and his nervous system were serious. He was forced to leave his seat for 3.5 years and go to Europe for treatment that was both painful and costly. Meanwhile, Massachusetts defiantly re-elected him, leaving his seat eloquently empty. Bleeding Sumner was thus joined with Bleeding Kansas as a political issue. The Free Soil North was mightily aroused against the uncouth and uncowardly bully Brooks. Copies of Sumner's abusive speech, otherwise doomed to obscurity, were sold by the tens of thousands. Every blow that struck the senator doubtless made thousands of Republican votes. The South, although not unanimous in approving Brooks, was angered not only because Sumner had made such an intemperate speech, but because it had been so extravagantly applauded in the North. The Sumner-Brooks clash and the ensuing reactions reveal how dangerously inflamed passions were becoming, North and South. It was ominous that the cultured Sumner should have used the language of a barroom bully, and that the gentlemanly Brooks should have employed the tactics and tools of a thug. Emotion was a displacing thought. The blows rained on Sumner's head were, broadly speaking, among the first blows of the Civil War. Old Buck versus the Pathfinder. With bullets whining in Kansas, the Democrats met in Cincinnati to nominate their presidential standard-bearer of 1856. They shied away from both the weak-kneed President Pierce and the dynamic Douglas. Each was too indelibly tainted by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The delegates finally chose James Buchanan, pronounced by many Buchanan, who was muscular, white-haired, and tall, 6 feet, with a short neck and a protruding chin. Because of an eye defect, he carried his head cocked to one side. A well-to-do Pennsylvania lawyer, he had been serving as minister to London during the recent Kansas-Nebraska uproar. He was therefore Kansas-less, and hence relatively enemy-less. But in a crisis that called for giants, old Do I say Buchanan or Buchanan? I don't know. I say Buchanan. Was mediocre, irresolute, and confused. Delegates of the fast-growing Republican Party met in Philadelphia with bubbling enthusiasm. Higher Law Seward was their most conspicuous leader, and he probably would have arranged to win the nomination had he been confident that this was a Republican year. The final choice was Captain John C. Fremont, the so-called Pathfinder of the West, a dashing but erratic explorer, soldier, surveyor who was supposed to find the path to the White House. The black-bearded and flashy young adventurer was virtually without political experience, but like Buchanan, But like Buchanan, he was not tarred with the Kansas brush. The Republican platform came out vigorously against the extension of slavery into the territories, while the Democrats declared no less emphatically for popular sovereignty. An ugly dose of anti-foreignism was injected into the campaign, even though slavery extension loomed largest. The recent influx of immigrants from Ireland to Germany had alarmed nativists, as many old-stock Protestants were called. They organized the American Party, also known as the Know-Nothing Party, because of its secretiveness, and in 1856 nominated the lackluster ex-president Millard Fillmore. Anti-foreign and anti-Catholic these super-patriots adopted the slogan, "Americans must rule America." Remnants of the dying Whig Party likewise endorsed Fillmore, and the Know-Nothings threatened to cut into Republican strength. Republicans fell in behind Fremont with the zeal of crusaders, shouting, "We follow the Pathfinder, and we are buck hunting." They organized glee clubs, which sang to the tune of the Marseillaise. I don't know that one. "Arise, arise, ye brave, and let our war cry be. Free speech, free press, free soil, free men, Fremont and victory." And free love sneered the Buchanan supporters. Or Buccaneers. Oh my god, okay, anyway, Buccaneers? I'm just gonna keep saying Buchanan. Mudslinging bespattered both candidates. Old, foggy Old Foggy Buchanan was assailed because he was a bachelor. The fiancée of his youth had died after a lover's quarrel. Fremont was reviled because of illegitimate birth, for his young mother had left her elderly husband, a Virginia planter, to run away with a French adventurer. In due season, she gave birth to John in Savannah, Georgia, further to shame the South. More harmful to Fremont was the allegation, which alienated many bigoted know-nothings and other nativists, that he was a Roman Catholic. The electoral fruits of 1856. A bland Buchanan, although polling less than a majority of the popular vote, won handily. His tally in the Electoral College was 174 to 114 for Fremont, with Fillmore garnering 8. The popular vote was 1,000,000 for 1,832,955 for Buchanan to 1,339,933 for Fremont, and 871,731 for Fremont. Those numbers do not matter. Why did the rousing Republicans go down to defeat? Fremont lost much ground because of the grave doubts as to his honesty, capacity, and sound judgment. Perhaps more damaging were the violent threats of the Southern fire eaters that the election of a sectional black Republican would be a declaration of war on them, forcing them to secede. Many Northerners, anxious to save both the Union and their profitable business connections with the South, were thus intimidated into voting for Buchanan. Excuse me. Innate conservatism triumphed, assisted by so-called Southern bullyism. It was probably fortunate for the Union that secession and Civil War did not come in 1856, following a Republican victory. Fremont, an ill-balanced and second-rate figure, was no Abraham Lincoln, and in 1856 the North was more willing to let the South depart in peace than it would be in 1860. Dramatic events from 1856 to 1860 were to arouse hundreds of thousands of still apathetic Northerners to a fighting pitch. Yet the Republicans in 1856 could rightfully claim a victorious defeat. The new party, a mere two-year-old toddler, had made an astonishing showing against the well-oiled Democratic machine. Whittier exulted. Then sound against the bugles called the muster roll anew. If months have well-nigh won the field, what may not 4 years do? The election of 1856 cast a long shadow forward, and politicians, North and South, peered anxiously toward 1860. The Dred Scott the Dred Scott bombshell. The Dred Scott versus Stanford decision, handed down by the Supreme Court on March 6, 1857, abruptly ended the two-day presidential honeymoon of the unlucky bachelor James Buchanan. This pronouncement was one of the opening paper gun blasts of the Civil War. Basically, the case was simple. Dred Scott, a black slave, had lived with his master for 5 years in Illinois and Wisconsin Territory. Backed by interested abolitionists, he sued for freedom on the basis of his long residence on free soil. The Supreme Court proceeded to twist a simple legal case into a complex political issue. It ruled, not surprisingly, that Dred Scott was a black slave and not a citizen, and hence could not sue in federal courts. The tribunal could then have thrown out the case on these technical grounds alone, but a majority decided to go further, under the leadership of emaciated Chief Justice Roger B. Taney from the slave state of Maryland. A sweeping judgment on the larger issue of slavery in the territory seemed desirable, particularly to forestall arguments by two free soil justices who were preparing dissenting opinions. The pro-Southern majority evidently hoped in this way to lay the odious question to rest. Taney's thunderclap rocked the Free Soilers back on their heels. A majority of the court decreed that, because a slave was private property, he or she could be taken into any territory and legally held there in slavery. The reasoning was that the Fifth Amendment clearly forbade Congress to deprive people of their property without due process of law. The court, to be consistent, went further. The Missouri Compromise banning slavery north of 3630 had been repealed 3 years earlier by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but its spirit was still venerated in the North. Now the court ruled that the Compromise of 1820 had been unconstitutional all along. Congress had no power to ban slavery from the territories, regardless even of what the territorial legislators themselves might want. Southerners were delighted with this unexpected victory. Champions of popular sovereignty were aghast, including Senator Douglas and a host of Northern Democrats. Another lethal wedge was thus driven between the northern and southern wings of the once united Democratic Party. Foes of slavery extension, especially the Republicans, were infuriated by the Dred Scott setback. Their chief rallying cry had been the banishing of bondage from the territories. They now insisted that the ruling of the court was merely an opinion, and not a decision, and no more binding than the views of a Southern debating society. Republican defiance of the exalted tribunal was intensified by an awareness that a majority of its members were Southerners, and by the conviction that it had debased itself, sullied and demeaned, by wallowing in the gutter of politics. Southerners, in turn, were inflamed by all this defiance. They began to wonder anew how much longer they could remain joined to a section that refused to honor the Supreme Court, to say nothing of the constitutional compact that had established it. The financial crash of 1857. Bitterness caused by the Dred Scott decision was deepened by hard times, which dampened a period of feverish prosperity. Then, the Panic of 1857 burst about Buchanan's harassed head. The storm was not so bad economically as the Panic of 1837, but psychologically it was probably the worst of the 19th century. What caused the crash? Inpouring California gold played its part by helping to inflate the currency. The demands of the Crimean War in Russia had overstimulated the growing of grain, while frenzied speculation in land and railroads had further ripped the economic fabric. When the collapse came, over 5,000 businesses had failed within a year. Unemployment, accompanied by hunger meetings in urban areas, was widespread. Bread or death, stated one desperate sign. The North, including its grain growers, was hardest hit. The South, enjoying favorable cotton prices abroad, rode out the storm with flying colors. Panic conditions seemed further proof that the cotton was king and that its economic kingdom was stronger than that of the North. This fatal delusion helped to drive the overconfident Southerners closer to a shooting showdown. Financial distress in the North, especially in agriculture, gave a new vigor to the demand for free farms of 160 acres from the public domain. For several decades, interested groups had been urging the federal government to abandon its ancient policy of selling the land for revenue. Instead, the argument ran, acreage should be given outright to the sturdy pioneers as a reward for risking health and life to develop it. The scheme to make outright gifts of homesteads encountered two-pronged opposition. Eastern industrialists had long been unfriendly to free land. Some of them feared that their underpaid workers would be drained off to the West. The South was even more bitterly opposed, partly because of the gang labor slavery Partly because gang labor slavery could not flourish on a mere 160 acres. Free farms would merely fill up the territories more rapidly with free soilers and further tip the political balance against the South. In 1860, after years of debate, Congress finally passed a Homestead Act, one that made public lands available at a nominal sum of 25 cents an acre. But the Homestead Act was stabbed to death by the veto pen of President Buchanan. I keep trying to say Buchanan. It's like a mix of them. Buchanan, near whose elbow sat leading Southern sympathizers. The Panic of 1857 also created a clamor for higher tariff rates. Several months before the crash, Congress, embarrassed by a large Treasury surplus, had enacted the Tariff of 1857. The new law, responding to the pressures from the South, reduced duties to about 20% on dutiable goods, the lowest point since the War of 1812. Hardly had the revised rates been placed on the books when financial misery descended like a black pall. Northern manufacturers, many of them Republicans, noisily blamed their misfortunes on the low tariff. As the surplus melted away in the Treasury, industrialists in the North pointed to the need for higher duties, but what really concerned them was their desire for increased protection. Thus, the Panic of 1857 gave the Republicans two surefire economic issues for the election of 1860: protection for the unprotected and farms for the farmless. In Illinois, rail splitter emerges. The Illinois senatorial election of 1858 now claimed the national spotlight. Senator Stephen A. Douglas's term was about to expire, and the Republicans decided to run against him, a rustic Springfield lawyer, one Abraham Lincoln. The Republican candidate, 6 feet 4 inches in height and 180 pounds in weight, presented an awkward but arresting figure. Lincoln's legs, arms, and neck were abnormally long. His head was crowned by coarse, black and unruly hair, and his face was sad, sunken, and weather-beaten. Lincoln was no silver spoon child of the elite. Born in 1809 in a Kentucky log cabin, to impoverished parents, he attended a frontier school for not more than a year. Being an avid reader, he was mainly self-educated. All his life he said "git, dar, and heerd." Although narrow-chested and somewhat stop-shouldered, he shone in his frontier community as a wrestler and weightlifter, and spent some time, among other pioneering pursuits, as a splitter of logs for fence rails. A superb teller of earthy and amusing stories, he would oddly enough plunge into protracted periods of melancholy. Lincoln's private and professional lives were not especially noteworthy. He married above himself socially into the influential Todd family of Kentucky, and the temperamental outbursts of his high-strung wife, known by her enemies as the she-wolf, helped to school him in patience and forbearance. After reading a little law, he gradually emerged as one of the dozen or so better-known trial lawyers in Illinois, although still accustomed to carrying important papers in his stovepipe hat. He was widely referred to as Honest Abe, partly because he would refuse cases that he had to suspend his conscience to defend. The rise of Lincoln as a political figure was less than rocket-like. After making his mark in the Illinois legislature as a Whig politician of the long-rolling variety, he served one undistinguished term in Congress, 1847 to 1849, until 1854, when he was 45 years of age. He had done nothing to establish a claim to statesmanship, but the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in that year lighted within him in unexpected fires. After mounting the Republican bandwagon, he emerged as one of the foremost politicians and orators of the Northwest. At the Philadelphia Convention of 1856, where John C. Fremont was nominated, Lincoln actually received 110 votes for the vice presidential nomination. I'm going to read this one last heading, actually. The Great Debate, Lincoln versus Douglas. Okay. Lincoln, as Republican nominee for the Senate seat, boldly challenged Douglas to a series of joint debates. This was a rash act because the stumpy senator was probably the nation's most devastating debater. Douglas promptly accepted Lincoln's challenge, and 7 meetings, the famed Lincoln-Douglas debates, were arranged from August to October 1858. At first glance, the two contestants seemed ill-matched. The well-groomed and polished Douglas, with his bear-like figure and bullhorn voice, presented a striking contrast to the lanky Lincoln, with his baggy clothes and unshined shoes. Moreover, Old Abe, as he was called in both affection and derision, had a piercing, high-pitched voice, and was often ill at ease when he began to speak. But as he threw himself into an argument, he seemed to grow in height, while his glowing eyes lighted up a rugged face. He relied on logic rather than table-thumping. The most famous debate came from Freeport, Illinois, where Lincoln nearly impaled his opponent on the horns of a dilemma. Suppose, he queried, the people of a territory should vote slavery down. The Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision had decreed that they could not. Who would prevail, the court or the people? Legend to the contrary, Douglas and some Southerners had already publicly answered the Freeport question. The little giant, therefore, did not hesitate to meet the issue head-on, honestly and consistently. His reply to Lincoln became known as the Freeport Doctrine. No matter how the Supreme Court ruled, Douglas argued, slavery would stay down if the people voted it down. Laws to protect slavery would have to be passed by the territorial legislators. They would not be forthcoming in the absence of popular approval, and black bondage would soon disappear. Douglas, in truth, had American history on his side. Where public opinion does not support the federal government, as in the case of Jefferson's embargo, the law is almost impossible to enforce. The upshot was that Douglas defeated Lincoln for the Senate seat. The little giant's loyalty to popular sovereignty, which still had a powerful appeal in Illinois, probably was decisive. Senators were then chosen by state legislators, and in the general election that followed the debates, more pro-Douglas members were elected than pro-Lincoln members. Yet thanks to inequitable apportionment, the districts carried by Douglas supporters represented a smaller population than those carried by Lincoln supporters. Honest Abe thus won a clear moral victory. Lincoln possibly was playing for larger stakes than just the senatorship. Although defeated, he had shambled into the national limelight in company with the most prominent northern politicians. Newspapers in the East published detailed accounts of the debates, and Lincoln began to emerge as a potential Republican nominee for president. But Douglas, in winning Illinois, hurt his own chances of winning the presidency, while further splitting his splintering party. After his opposition to the Lecompton Constitution for Kansas and his further defiance of the Supreme Court at Freeport, Southern Democrats were Southern Democrats were determined to break up the party and the Union rather than accept him. The Lincoln-Douglas debate platform thus proved to be one of the preliminary battlefields of the Civil War. Okay, and that is all. Yay.